Great. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Disability and Media panel. My name is Alex. I'm a culture editor at Roar News, and I will be your host today. So we have four amazing panelists who will talk to you today. We also have two BSL interpreters, so thank you all so much for being here. As for how the event is going to work, at first we're going to get introductions from the panelists, then there will be a main part of the panel, which will be the discussion and asking panelists questions. There will be one 5-minute break in between at around 6:45. Then there will be another break at 7:30. And by the end, we will have a Q&A session. If there are any questions, if anyone has any questions, you can just put them in the chat and we'll try to answer as many of them as we can. But yeah, that's it from me. And I think we can move on to the introductions now. So why don't we start with Jamie?
Of course. Hi, thank you so much for having me. Sound working okay?
Yes, it's great.
Brilliant. So I'm Jamie Hale. My pronoun is they. I work across the media, so partially journalism for places like Guardian or Novara, partially in radio where needed, but at the moment primarily as a screenwriter and occasional actor. So I come from a kind of disability arts and theatre background. I founded and run a disability arts development organisation, but then ended up moving into writing for television entirely by accident, which I will talk about when we talk about how people got their feet in the industry. So aside from that, my work is primarily either sort of charity health and social care policy work, or my arts work, where I run an artistic organisation called Cryptic Arts, which primarily focuses on writing and theatre and performance. So we do artistic development work, online retreat, biannual Barbican showcase, and kind of year-round support workshops, etc., all for deaf and disabled writers. And I've always been interested in media and journalism, but certainly didn't anticipate ending up here the way I have. And I'm really looking forward to kind of hearing from everyone else who is here tonight, and also your questions when we come to them.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Lucy, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Lucy. I'm a freelance writer and journalist covering disability, mainly social care, COVID-related shenanigans, and access issues. Before that, I was a BBC political reporter, where I covered everything from elections to pandemics. And now I'm starting to write a memoir about being a disabled woman and the overlap of sexism and ableism.
Thank you so much. Lydia?
Okay, so my name's Lydia. My pronouns, not my name. My pronouns are she, her. I have been freelance since I graduated, I guess. So that was back in 2018. I've only been a qualified journalist under the NCTJ since then. I was diagnosed as being on the autistic spectrum when I was 2 months shy of turning 16. I mainly covered disability and kind of social justice issues. So that has been from things like police corruption to the children's in terms of the pandemic. And my work has appeared in places like The Independent and Refinement 29. Right now, I'm just 3 days away from finishing my first book to the deadline, and that's about it.
Right, great, thank you. Rachel?
Hi, I'm Rachel, like Alex just said. My pronouns are she and they. I am a disabled journalist. I've written for places like The Guardian, The Independent, Metro, and Business Insider. I write about health and disability and the intersection of those to do with poverty and how they just how they have really oh, I lost what I was going to say there for a second. How they have really just, sorry, I'm going through the menopause at the minute, so my brain is not doing great and I've not been well for the last couple of days. Yeah, so primarily at the moment I'm focusing a lot on COVID. That is where I've been for the last couple of years, and that led me to set up the Unwritten, which is where I am at the moment. I am the founder and editor of the Unwritten. We are a publication for disabled people, and we are focusing on giving disabled people a voice in a time when a lot of the time we're being told that our stories aren't relevant because they're not inspirational or they're not trauma driven enough. So we want to really focus on the places in the middle and the stories that are worth telling that aren't just inspirational. And as well as that, I'm also a health and disability reporter for Healthline, not Healthline, for Very Well Health. I've written for Healthline before. And what else? Oh, and in 2021, I won the Women in Journalism Award for the Georgina Henry Award for business innovation for setting up the Unwritten. And I think that's about everything. I'm going to go have a lie down now.
Everyone. It's great to have so many different experiences. So the first question is about how you got started in the industry. So I thought we could start with Jamie. I know your work is very interdisciplinary. You have experience with poetry and script writing and journalism and TV. And yeah, it'd be great to hear how it all started and how it went from there to where you're at now.
So my background is very much in kind of poetry and in writing poetry for performance. And that was sort of where I sat quite happily. I performed at a kind of semi-regular Barbican showcase and was very much focusing on my creative career from that angle. I hadn't really particularly thought about the media industry. I've done some work with the BBC in my late teens, but not since then. I grew up without a television, so I don't tend to think of television particularly often. I say it with an enormous one at the end of my bed now, how life has changed. So my route in was, I think, very atypical, but I think an atypical route is often found by people for whom the typical routes are not accessible. In that I happened to reference an obscure character in Greek mythology in a poem, and there was somebody in the audience writing a show for Netflix about that character, which was an enormous coincidence, and meant that I got brought on board as a consultant, and then as a researcher and contributor in the writer's room for the show. And that made me think, oh, you know what, maybe I should think about writing a script sometime. So early in the pandemic, I wrote a play. At the time I had just had my poetry pamphlet, Shield, out, which was a kind of frenzied sonnet cycle from the first 3 months of the pandemic. And Grey Eye commissioned me to write a monologue. Grey Eye are a deaf and disabled led theatre company. Part of that involves some mentoring from a TV writer who does a lot of work with disabled people. So he gave me some script advice. I worked on the script. I sent it to the friend writing the Netflix show, who said, oh, do you mind if I send it to a friend? And that friend was a drama commissioner at Channel 4, who said, well, write me some pitches and I'll commission something. So I wrote some pitches and got a script commissioned, and realized that I probably have to start watching television from time to time. So I had that kind of very atypical route in. But once I kind of started moving into it, I really realized the kind of the importance of networking, I guess, and of making sure, you know, after every meeting, there's a thank you. It was lovely to meet you, XYZ email, that I followed conversations up, that I introduced people to each other, and that I kind of made sure that I wasn't ever going into a meeting that I wasn't very prepared for. So when someone said in a meeting, oh, I'm actually really interested in this, I could say brightly, you know what, I've got a script that might appeal to you, even if that script was more of an idea than a script. And so that kind of networking became really crucial to me in kind of getting my foot a bit further into the industry, along with a lot of kind of work on what my brand was and the work I wanted to produce and what I was interested in, so that when someone asked, I could say, well, you know, I'm really interested in morally complex decisions made under pressure where there is no perfect solution. And that gives me a lot of leeway with characters, but it's the through line that goes through my work. And so kind of having those things prepared meant that I could get through more doors, and I got another 3 projects optioned. So I've got 1 in production with Gaumont, 2 optioned by Red, and 1 optioned by Bridge 06. And I've just like kind of kept going from there, really. So I think basically for me, it was a lot of luck. It was a lot of support, and it was the fact that a coincidence worked in my favor. And I think that's really fueled a lot of what I want to do with supporting other people into the industry, because I know that if I hadn't Googled that obscure character and found them on Wikipedia the day before the performance, I probably wouldn't be in this position now.
All right, well, thank you for all that. I mean, maybe some of it was luck, but I'm sure, you know, a lot of it was just genuine passion and hard work. And that's, honestly, it's amazing to hear people's stories. So thank you for sharing that. So maybe, Lucy, could you tell us about your story? I know that you wrote in university, and then you also worked with BBC, and then you went freelance recently. So it'd be interesting to hear, your
Yeah, so I think my career can be summed up as being in the right place at the right time. Sometimes by design and sometimes by sheer luck. I started very early on a blog when I was a teenager, which meant that when I got my first bit of work experience through my aero, I had a portfolio of work that I could show the editor. And she said, why don't you write for us? So I started university with a freelancing gig that didn't pay me anything. And then one day I stumbled across the Guardian's Student Journalist Awards, as they were at the time, and I found it the day before the deadline. Classic Lucy. I sent in some blog posts and some stuff that I'd done my first job. And I won somehow. And no one was more surprised than I was. And that opened a lot of doors. Got my work experience at the Guardian, so I started writing for them. I wrote to them for about 4 years. And then a Guardian editor put me in touch with the editor at the BBC, who got me work experience on Newsnight. And while I was there, the BBC opened its scheme for disabled journalists. So I was able to talk to people about what to put in the application because I was in the building, which was another piece of extreme good timing. And then I got a place on that scheme. I worked there for 4 years in different jobs, mostly in politics, and then decided that I wanted to be doing more social justice stuff, which obviously you can't do in the BBC. So I've gone through that last August. I've been writing for The Guardian, a bit for The Times, and a bit for the FT. Yeah, and now I'm here.
Great, thank you. Yeah, definitely a good thing to hear for student journalists out there that, it counts, that you start early. Lydia, why don't you talk about your story? I know you're also freelance, you also have experiences in copywriting, and I know you're writing that book, which personally I'm really, really interested in.
Oh, okay. Well, in answer to the question, I kind of feel like I haven't gotten my foot in, and that is primarily on the basis. So, autistic people are by far and large the least employed disability group, and that is at a national level. So when it comes to when people say how they got their foot in, I kind of feel like I haven't, because the thing is, despite me being qualified and having written for many, many years now, I've never actually had what you would call a proper job in the industry. So, and this will be part of in terms of the conversation later, but very often it was kind of like very discriminatory in terms of the interviews I went into. I have actually only had one journalistic interview where I had any reasonable adjustments ever. So in terms of how I kind of sort of got to the position I am now, I'm only 22. First of all, I kind of started writing when I was at secondary school. So the first thing I had published was when I was 11, which kind of sounds like really sort of like precocious brat kind of thing. But it in the sense that, so after I was diagnosed, I was very aware that people would see the label before seeing me, and that with that comes a hell of a lot of preconceptions, because people think that you're going to be like Rain Man, or that you're going to be like, whatever stereotype comes to mind. So I remember sort of thinking, okay, here are the things that apparently society deems I find difficult, but this is how I can use it as to my advantage. So as an example, I find it very difficult. Sorry, I'm slightly I find it difficult when, like in terms of social conversations, I'm not always aware of social cues, for example. That's really useful in being able to ask quite difficult questions in interviews. So when it came to interviewing people like Alan Rusbridger, Lucy will know this person, the former editor of The Guardian, I got to ask him, for example, did he consider himself a feminist, despite the fact that he had a membership of the Garrick Club, which is very controversial. So I did my NCTJ, thanks to the Journalism Diversity Fund, and I've kind of just sort of like freelanced ever since, in the sense of just pitching a lot. Obviously, there is kind of caveats to this. In order to make an income, you need different income streams and all that sort of thing. So I run things like newsletters, podcasts, various other things. In terms of the book I'm writing, that was just quite a majorly stressful project. And frankly, I'm very grateful that it's nearly done.
Right. Yeah, thank you. And yeah, as I said, I'd be really interested in purchasing that book, though I can imagine what the process of it would have been stressful. So Rachel, why don't you tell us about your story? I know you're also an editor-in-chief of a magazine. It'd be interesting to hear how that happened, but also how you got started in the industry, just generally.
Goodness, well, I have been in journalism for about 5 years, but I started out, I would say, I didn't get my foot in the door, but I started out by blogging, probably like about 10-12 years ago, and this was like in the days when blogging really first exploded. Like I got to go to things because I was one of like the medium fashion bloggers of the time. Nobody knows who I am now, but I was like I was sort of well known at the time. So I got to go to things like London Fashion Week and stuff like that when they first started allowing fashion bloggers to go, like back in 2010 and 2011 and 2012. I went for 5 seasons to Fashion Week, and it was amazing. And then I started, because I was using fashion blogging as an escape at the time from writing about my disabilities, and from really facing up to the fact that I wasn't, as an escape from like the things that were going on in my body, and it wasn't a healthy coping mechanism, because in a way it was making me worse. And I didn't write about disability for a long time, probably until about 2016. So like for a good 6 years, for a good 6 years I was writing. I didn't start writing about disability, and then I realized that yes, I was doing a lot of this writing, but I needed, well, no, actually I started writing about it when I got really bad with my undiagnosed mental health, and then reproductive problems, and I started using that as an outlet. And that started picking up traction because I had a really bad experience with the Marina coil, and that was around the time that there was investigations into the Marina coil, and not a lot of news outlets were talking about that. So I became so somebody from the Metro picked that up and asked us to write about that. And then it was just little drips and drabs like that, and I realized, okay, this is something I should actually be talking about, because people are interested in hearing about it, and it was helping me. Like, it was helping me to talk about my disabilities and my mental health. And it had been long enough for us hiding it. Like, it had been too long that I was hiding my disabilities and hiding my problems, and I realized that I didn't need to hide them anymore. And it was really a big fundamental shift, I think, that it took for us to realize that I needed to stop hiding them. And a big part of that was, like, sorry, this is going off on such a big life tangent, but this is legitimately how I got to it. So then a big part of this was so then I started writing for the Metro more often, and I started going freelance, and I started writing for other little places. I did some stuff for the Independent. It was iNews, and then it was things like Healthline, the now defunct Forks. I'd done bits for Stylist, and then the big breakthrough was when I got sober. I realised that I wanted to make this a career, because before this I always thought this is something I could do, but I never had the willpower to do it, and I never thought that I could do this as a job, because again there was a lot of internalized ableism in myself, and all of these things that I'd always been told, like, oh, you've not got the energy to do a real job. And this goes back to some of the bits of what Lydia was saying, of like things that we're told as disabled people, like especially when you've got things like chronic illnesses and stuff like that, because newsrooms are not created for disabled people. So I always thought I'm not going to be able to hold down a real journalism job, even though it's something that I wanted to do from being little. So I decided that I wanted to go into freelance, and I started doing more and more freelance. And then when the pandemic hit, it was awful. It was awful for disabled people, even more so. I mean, it was awful for everybody, but to see how much it was hitting the community, and seeing just how much people almost didn't care how much it was hitting the disabled community, and seeing my disabled writer friends struggling to get all of these stories out there, and struggling to be heard. That was like, me as a disabled writer, like at the time I was starting to be known as a voice in the disabled community, and so was Lucy, and so was Lydia, but like there was a lot of, you were, Lydia, shut up. But there was a lot of people who like were just struggling to get their voices out there completely. And then there was like, and then it finally came. I think my best friend had gotten sick of me complaining every single day about how much nobody wanted wanted to hear my story or our stories, and she just went, okay, why don't you set up your own publication? And I swear to God, it what she said, she claims it wasn't in that tone, but it was in that tone. That's how frustrated she was. So in the end I went, I could do this. I mean, I could do this. I've been writing, I've been running WordPress blogs, and obviously it was going to be I knew it was going to be tough. I knew it wasn't going to be easy, but it was something that I knew that the community really bloody needed. So I put out like a couple of tweets and I was like, hypothetically, if we set this up, would anybody be interested? And I got hundreds, absolutely hundreds of tweets back. So me, myself, Caroline, and I think at the point there was a couple of others went about setting up the website. My husband is a WordPress developer. Luckily, I felt really lucky there with that one. So he set the website up, and then I just went ahead and launched it without telling him. So he was really angry with us for that. So yeah, and that's how the Unwritten came to be. That was just over a year ago, and we have gone from strength to strength to strength. And honestly, it's the best decision I've ever made. It's one of those things where I do happy, like my team, Caroline and Kath and Hannah, cry, laugh, take the mick out me on a daily basis because all I do is cry. Like, it makes me so happy and makes me do happy tears on a daily basis. It's the best thing I ever could have imagined doing, but it was needed, and it came at a time that was really, really needed. And even without the pandemic, like, because we don't even focus that many stories on the pandemic, it was just such a needed space for disabled people, and I never realised how much it was needed. And I hate to claim that much, but it was like there wasn't that many spaces for disabled people before it.
Right. Yeah, thank you for being so open, and I agree. I mean, it's still needed, definitely. So the next question is actually aligned with some of the things that have already been mentioned, which is some of the barriers and accessibility issues you come across working in the sector. So it'd be great to hear about that, and also whether there are any adjustments or opportunities the media sector specifically should provide for disabled people. So I thought we could start with Lydia this time, because I know you mentioned that in your last time in the last question. I also remember reading your article about putting an autism disclaimer. I found that was really interesting. You could talk about your experiences with regards to that.
Okay. I just want to say as a disclaimer for people who are watching this that everyone's experience is different before I say this, because I'm trying not to, I'm just very aware when people hear me talking this sort of sense that sometimes it can be very off-putting in the sense of I want a career but now I don't want to type thing. I think so. In terms of, I can only really speak to my barriers. It's not my job to represent other people, particularly if I don't have the same condition they have. So that would be really inappropriate, I think. The first thing first, it's very important to mention that being a part of the least employed disability group played a major role in this. So everyone would sort of say like, oh, just go and apply for this job or that job. And I think particularly in terms of the NCTJ, there was very much an expectation that, I remember lecturers saying, you're going to be headhunted, all of you, and you'll just go straight to the national news. I think, first of all, that is not true. It's very rare for someone to just go from being a trainee to like the Sun or the Guardian. I know a few people who did, but they were outliers. Added to this, so if I was lucky enough in the sense of the application having been, actually accepted, which 90% of the time it's not, largely on some very spurious basis, I would say. If I went to an interview, I've only ever had one interview where they made reasonable adjustments. So every other paper I went to, even though they said like, oh yes, we are this, we're so down with you type thing, nothing was ever done, even if I asked for it. That's really indicative of a media that says we want to be diverse, that isn't. And that will not become diverse unless something is done, such as, just following the basic law that you should be complying with. So I remember going to one particular newspaper, I'm not going to name because on the grounds of libel and all that sort of thing, that kind of prided itself on, being disability friendly. It wasn't. And I remember they asked me for feedback. When it came back, I hadn't got the job. Despite the fact that I was the most qualified in the room, everyone else was still a trainee. I'd been qualified for 2 years by then, and I had more bylines than anyone else in the room. The person in charge of the looking after the reasonable adjustments actually came back, and she went on the offensive. So when I started to say, look, you've not actually put anything in place, she goes, well, I was in the room and I was doing all this and all that, but really sort of not listening. That in itself is really quite worrying when the person who is in charge of looking after us isn't listening to the people that they should be, advocating for. That's been my experience pretty much everywhere I've been. And it's also in the sense of, so people love stereotypes. Journalists love stereotypes for some reason. I say that just generally because I've only ever met maybe 2 people who have actually gotten me. Like they've not stereotyped me from in the sense of working with them. So it would be in the sense of, oh, you're female, you're autistic. Oh my God, this has totally blown my mind because this can't be true. That's just, this is my experience. So I have been freelance ever since I graduated. I know I would be fully capable of having a staff job, but it's just very kind of like, I was saying to friends the other day, I kind of am starting to say, what is the point of being part of an industry that is supposedly set up on the grounds of we tell the truth and we are the arbiters of truth, such as when it comes to politics or culture or whatever. We can't tell the truth about ourselves or, actually help the truth in the sense of being representative and all that sort of thing. I'm not sure that answers the question, but if there's other points, do ask.
No, it does. Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing all your experiences. So Lucy, why don't you tell us about your experiences?
I've been fairly lucky in the sense that people understand the concept that I can't walk. And that's quite black and white. So in terms of the big organizations that I've worked for, they've been very good at access and places for my carers and what have you. I did have the problem when I was really young of applying for work experience at more magazines or local papers, and they just physically were not accessible. There's a lot of stairs in local news, as it turns out. But as I said, the Guardian was very accessible and the BBC was very accessible. But what no one really ever understood was fatigue. I get really tired to the point where I can't sit up anymore. And my boss would often say, oh, just don't come in. I get to find I have a day off. Or, just go home when you're tired. Yeah, but I'm kind of always tired. I need to be able, sometimes, not all the time, to work from home. And before the pandemic, the BBC did not understand the concept of working from home. So they always said, yes, of course, but actually none of the software worked from home. So I couldn't actually do my job from home. So I had to go in, even when they were saying, oh, it's fine doing it from home. So I think that wasn't really understood. And then they're kind of more abstract sense, like the media wants to say, oh, we've got disabled people, we're gonna be more representative. The BBC hired all of us on this game. We all had different disabilities that looked fantastic. And it was nice not to be pigeonholed into disability stories. But the flip side of that was that we almost couldn't do disability stories because I think they thought we were too close to it and we wouldn't be objective. So I was working at Westminster, and I would say shielding policy is a joke, it's not working. All these people being abandoned by the government. I wasn't allowed to tell that story because that was not impartial. So I had to find ways to tell it that I thought were worse, so that it would be, impartial. Which is how I found myself quitting a well-paid full-time job. Because I was annoyed. I think the media thinks that it wants to tell stories, but it doesn't really.
Right, thank you. It's definitely going to tie into that one of the other questions about, the stories that should be told, the stories we want to tell. So thank you for sharing that. So Rachel, why don't you tell us about your experiences?
I'm an old lady, so I always forget to unmute. Yeah, so for me, it would be things like the fact that before the pandemic, newsrooms, you always had to do it in person, and the majority of journalism jobs, you couldn't do it from home. Like, anytime I applied for a journalism job and asked if I could do it from home, it would be, oh no, we can't do that, you've got to come into the office. And I applied for 5 years for journalism jobs, asking, can I do this from home? Is this able to do remote? Look, I'm doing the work. I've been like, these are places that I'd written for like 5, 6 times, and I'm going, look, you can see that I'm handing the work in, I can do the work. Is there any way that I can write for you on a full-time basis and still be doing this from home? And then I'm going, oh no, we need to have you in the office. We need to have you in the office. So for everything suddenly on a massive wide scale, like hundreds, sometimes thousands of staff, to suddenly at the click of a finger to suddenly be going to going to working from home when the pandemic hit was just absolutely golden. It was like, I couldn't but like, me and the amount of disabled people who found it just absolutely golden how quickly everything was able to go working from home when they needed it for non-disabled people was just, it was horrific. Because like the whole reason that I'd never been able to have a full-time journalism career up until this year, when I was lucky enough to be hired by Very Well Health, and again, that probably wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for them all being working from home at the minute, was because I never thought that I'd be able to work a full-time job, but because I was always told that I'd never be able to work a staff job because I couldn't do it from home. And now it's suddenly so able to be able to be done from home. And it's like like they need, like, I think to say, like, non-disabled people needed to realise, it's awful to say because obviously it's not the pandemic that's made them realise, it's the way that they have been working that have made them, like, they've realised that the way they've working just doesn't work. It doesn't work for everybody, and it doesn't work for the majority of people. Like the amount of people that don't want to go back into the office now, like, is awful, is like humongous, because it's not a sustainable way of working, but we've always been told that it's the way that we should be working. And because it was only disabled people and people that were deemed who shouldn't be working, and, you know, we're not productive members of society, they weren't bothered about us working. They weren't bothered about us not having jobs, because we weren't seen as people who they cared about having jobs before. So, but now that everybody needs to be kept safe and needs to be able to work from home, it's suddenly sprung up. And I could rant about the suddenly surgence of working from home, and believers I have in about 5 different articles. But yeah, that's the big one, the working from home. And again, like Lucy mentioned, the understanding of fatigue, the understanding that we can't just take an afternoon off, because fatigue is always there. Like, you can't just take it, like, there's so little understanding, I think, about chronic conditions, because physical conditions, you know, it's something that can be seen, but chronic conditions are still so little understood, because it's just lack of education. And like, that's the one thing I wish people understood about my disability overall, but especially in work. Like, chronic conditions, like fatigue is just all encompassing, and it's always there, you know. Like, so when you say, like, oh, I can't hand this in today because like my brain's just not working, like you can probably tell right now my brain's not working very well. I've got a cold right now, so my brain's not working. But you know, like, I've been really lucky working with Very Well, that I can, like, this is the first job I've had where I've not been worried that I'm going to get fired because I can't hand a job, because I can't hand something in, like, because I've got to hand something in a day late. There's been places I've worked before, and this was working in other things as well, not just journalism, working, like, for taking time off and stuff, that I'm going to get fired for taking time off. But there's just such a lack of understanding for chronic conditions that there needs to be more of. And I'm rambling, so I'm going to stop.
No, you're absolutely right, Maria. Thank you. And hopefully there will be more.
If it's all right.
Yeah,
if it's all right, could I just add 2 things to what Rachel said?
Yeah, sure.
So the first thing, in terms of newsrooms, I think this is important to point out, just because part of the issue, I think, is in terms of how essentially the news trade is dying. We all know that. Local news is hardly, you know, it doesn't exist anymore. So there was a piece of research done by a Guardian journalist, Nick Davis, in his book Flat Earth News, and he actually had he measured the amount of time that journalists were spending in the office compared to when he started out. So when he was starting out, he'd go in maybe, like, you know, 1 afternoon a week type thing, because he wasn't always needed there. They didn't have, like, you know, the internet and all that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So he actually pointed out, and he measured this, and he even, like, he actually went, and what transpired was that reporters are having to file more often to fill spaces, and added to this, they're spending more time in the office just because we don't have an effective model in terms of dealing with the internet. We're filing round the clock, so therefore we spend more time in the office. But that's actually in the sense of most people have an internet connection. So the fact that we are being told to come into an office to file something you can do from home is arguably counterproductive if you want representation, such as in terms of disability. It just doesn't make sense. And also, you're going to be saving in terms of office costs if someone's working from home as well. It's cost effective. Newspapers are dying. They're always in the deficit in terms of their budget. Why not save a few quid?
It literally feels like things with offices with me. It literally feels like a way for bosses to just keep an eye on the workers. That is literally
Yeah.
what it feels like.
It just, we don't need people standing over us. I mean, we're all, you know, adults here.
All adults. That's literally just what it feels like at the
But
minute. Like,
also, like, editors sometimes a bit older, they don't seem to know how to use the internet.
Yeah,
to
it's also,
communicate.
Rachel, I think it was you. I think I read one of your articles a little while ago. So this is just to pick up on the point about fatigue. I think it was you when it was saying, in terms of being assessed for personal independence payment by the Department for Work and Pensions, I think it was your article where it said, where you said that you couldn't do X amount of hours or something. And they just said, oh, but you can still work because you can do 6 hours a week kind of thing, and you can take all the other time off. I'm sorry, but that is that's sort of.
I got told I could work
point.
for 1 hour. I got told I could work for 1 hour a day.
Yeah. So
Perfect.
They told me I could go
just
to the
sort of-
office for 1 hour a day.
if you want to work in a journalistic role, they aren't going to do that, because nobody makes that sort of thing in terms of a job description, are they? So it just, in terms of the support we receive as well, in terms of state funded support, it's kind of a catch-22. Like, it's just that you can't win.
Yeah, it's ridiculous, man. Absolutely ridiculous. Sorry, we're gonna stop now.
No, it's great. Honestly, that's the whole thing. Yeah, thank you. So far we've been hearing mostly about journalism. So maybe Jamie, you could tell us more about other spheres of media, because obviously you have experience with other areas as well.
So I think for me, honestly, the primary barriers I faced came from outside the media world. So I was in special education as a result of learning disabilities as a child, and I was out of education from 14. So there was no real expectation of developing a career at all. And kind of what I could do deteriorated with my condition. The things that were kind of feasible for me at one point became infeasible at another, and I didn't really see how a workplace would ever kind of adjust for that or make it possible. And the idea of being able to work was just, until about 2.5 years ago, completely infeasible, because I had several social care calls a day, and between those I was trapped in bed or trapped in my wheelchair. But since I can't open doors myself, it was functionally broadly the same, trapped. So the ability to have a job was just completely impossible because I didn't have the support in place. And then issues around things like accessible transport and the ability to get to a workplace. Again, I just faced such kind of significant barriers there that the idea of being able to have a career, let alone a kind of enjoyable career, just seemed impossible. Work from home wasn't really a thing. And then I think for me, actually, again, it kind of came from outside the industry, that once I had 24/7 care, I was then able to start looking at kind of working, because if I want to be at my computer, I need someone to come in and set all of the tech up, and then someone to come in and move it away when I'm done with it, and someone to come and change my position, and all of these things, where it was just impossible for me to work unless I could kind of work from home and have the right support. So, I mean, I was very lucky in terms of screenwriting, because so much of that world, it's very much the person who leads the writer's room that kind of sets the tone for how things are going to work. So my first job was for a writer was for the Netflix show written by someone called Charlie Cavell, who wrote a show called The End of the Fucking World and a few other things. And I was admitted to hospital right before I was about to start the job. And Charlie said, well, that's not a problem, work from hospital. So I worked full time from hospital for 6 months in 2019. And it was just completely made feasible because they wanted me on the project. I needed to be able to work from the hospital. I needed to be able to say, oh, I can't work today, or oh, I can't work this week, or oh, I can work extra, I'll pick up a few extra things. And that was just, it was incredibly flexible because the right person was there with the right attitude. And I think since then, because my projects have been self-led, where I'm either the lead writer or co-lead with another disabled writer with similar requirements to me, it's been very much that we've been able to set the tone of the process, that I don't have a very good short-term memory. So if I'm meeting with a commissioner, I either have my access to work assistant taking notes, or I just ask the commissioner I'm meeting with to take notes for me in the meeting, which seems to have kind of worked absolutely fine so far. I think I find it quite frustrating that there were kind of anticipatory adjustments that could be put in place for other people to have these sorts of experiences in the media. But I'm also very aware that for me, it's not just that the biggest barriers came from outside the media world, but I think what I found difficult was that they were barriers that I wanted the media world to be challenging. I didn't want to have to say, as I did have to say, I'm sorry, I can't take up this opportunity because I don't have enough care hours and they won't fund me for any more. What I wanted was for the media response to that to be the kind of the ridiculous anger that people who wanted to work and could work were being prevented from working by barriers that functionally arise from the political system. And I wanted the media to be focusing on these issues and spotlighting them and improving them. And instead, I think it sometimes seemed to me that barriers were seen as kind of absolute and fixed and unlucky because it wasn't, it wasn't a job related adjustment they could make. It was the fact that I didn't have the care or whatever, or the accessible transport. When I was kind of like, well, you're the media, can't you talk about these issues? Can't you try and change the terrain more broadly for all disabled people, not just those of us that want to work in the media? So I think that was kind of my experience. I think in terms of opportunities, there are increasing opportunities in the screenwriting world for deaf and disabled people. There's Jack Thorne helped set up Underlying Health Conditions, which is a really brilliant group, and he's been very personally supportive, which is great. There's a lot more interest due to his McTaggart lecture in stories written by deaf and disabled people that kind of go outside the whole sort of tragic model. So I think that's why I've had more luck getting things picked up. But I think that it's this kind of very patchwork situation in which if you get the right person and they put the right things in place, that's brilliant. But if you don't, then you've not got any chance. And a situation in which so many of the factors are outside the immediate control of the media, but are not factors that the media cannot affect if it wants to. And it's that sense that it doesn't that's going to be quite difficult.
Thank you for sharing. I think we're definitely going to come back to some of it in terms of COVID and working from home, and also telling certain kinds of stories that are not being told. But I think we're going to take a 5-minute break before we move on, so that we can all just take a breath. And so it'd be great if you could be back at 7:09 or 7:10. And so yeah, so I'll see you all soon. Okay, so no proper panel would be complete without a COVID question, I suppose. So that the next question is about the impact of COVID on the media sector and on your work specifically. So I thought we could start with you, Rachel, because I know you wrote a lot about COVID. So and you already, I know you already mentioned it a few times. So yeah, but if there's anything else you'd like to say about the impact of COVID?
Well, if it wasn't for COVID, I wouldn't have started the Unwritten for starters. But yeah, I really became properly, well, I was already freelance, but I really started like noticing the impact of disability and how little like disabled writers are taken seriously in media, like especially during COVID, because it was like we were just completely thrown towards the wayside. And even though we were the ones who, you know, were the most qualified to talk about what was happening to not only our community, but what was happening in a mass disabling event, we were just being completely disregarded, you know, like even though we weren't qualified immunologists, we were the people who knew what it was like to go through becoming suddenly disabled and to go through these things, like having to isolate and having to shelter from our families and stuff like that. But we weren't being asked to write these things. We were being asked to comment on these things and not be paid for it. But we weren't being asked to write these things. And then when we were trying to pitch these articles, that, you know, from our own experiences, we were being told, oh no, we've already got staff writers that are writing these things, you know. So it was non-disabled people that were telling our stories, and it was a lot of non-disabled people that were telling our stories. And then as the pandemic wore on, and they realized this is non-disabled editors realized that it wasn't going away, they started getting bored of disabled people's stories, for want of a better word. They started getting bored of disabled people's stories. And the more we were pitching, and this was the time when figures like 6 in 10 people who died were disabled were coming out. They started getting bored, and they weren't writing about the fact that 6 in 10 people who died were disabled. I mean, when that figure came out, it was hardly written about at all, and it should have been like breaking news at the top of every bloody news bulletin that day, that week. But it was barely written about because, well, you know, the vulnerable people were going to die, and that was how it was going to be from the very beginning. The vulnerable people were going to die, so like they weren't bothered that it was that many people that had died. So that was just my breaking point, you know. I mean, I'd already broken before then, so that was when I knew that I needed to do something. And that even since then, it's been hard just making people care. And it's hard, like, if anything, this has just really brought out how little disabled people care about disabled people. But it's just been hard. Like, and this is one of these things that really gets me angry, just how little people have cared about disabled people in the pandemic. Like, it's like I want to think that it's about protecting themselves and protecting their own, but it's just a systemic and something that's been brought from the government and from just decades and decades of being told that the disabled people are the ones that are going to die anyway, and they're the ones that are scrounging, and they're the ones that, you know, do nothing, and they give nothing to society. So of course people are going to think this about disabled people when it's what a lot of us, you know, people in their 20s, 30s, 40s have been told for all their lives. Of course it's what they're going to think. So you can't blame people for half of it, but at the end of the day, you know, people should really be knowing better about the government now. And that's where I am. Yeah.
Thank you for, yeah, it is infuriating. It's just what it is. So Lucy, what about you? How did COVID impact you and your work? And I know you went during COVID. So
I could not agree with more with Rachel. BBC News covered live case, which would just mind-bending. Because I was at Westminster, I covered every press conference without coverage for 6 months. So it's a lot, it's intense. I think I survived it by talking to other disabled people. And then I thought, those statistics that Rachel mentioned came out, and I thought, well, I'm working for BBC News, and I've got the power to tell my story to a mass audience. And I couldn't get commissioned. I was all around it. To editors, I had to go to a different team and say, I can do this. And eventually I got a commission. I wrote probably one of the longest pieces that BBC published for a while. About the statistics. But it didn't feel like enough. And it didn't feel like I'd used the position that I had to tell that story. I knew people who were shooting, I knew people who were just really scared. And the BBC wasn't letting me tell that story. Which is essentially why I quit. There were other things going on too, but essentially that was what drove me to I felt too responsible. I wasn't telling the story. I'm very lucky that actually editors that I have at the Guardian elsewhere knew me. And when I said, let me tell the story, they did. So I've written about the shooting and stuff, the Guardian and tortoise, and I feel better because I've mentioned noise. I feel better when I mention noise. I mean, obviously working from home in a way which is great for me because I have fatigue and self-body, so hey, brilliant. But then there was a point where everyone went back to the office and I didn't go back to the office because I couldn't. And that was really alienating in a way I hadn't felt at work before. That was a bit of a weird experience. But then being free out, like all free out to work from home, so I don't feel left out. I feel like I'm doing whatever I have to. So it's been swings and roundabouts. But I'm very lucky. I think my editors know that I know my politics because of the job that I've just done for 2 years. And therefore let me comment on the politics of disability in a way that I don't think gets talked about. So basically, I'm trying.
Yeah, thank you. We'll definitely come back to that, to the stories that need to be told. So, but Lydia, what about you? And
when it comes to impact, so The thing about this is, so I remember the pandemic, the beginning of the pandemic really well, because essentially I had gone to the US for my 21st birthday for just a weekend. The moment that I touched British soil was when just like all of my work was cancelled, all of my commissions went, all of my editors stopped working because they'd all been like laid off and couldn't commission me. Like the whole of my business that I'd spent ages building up just went in the space of about a week. It began to pick up kind of more towards like June, the beginning of June, towards the middle of and the end of last year. But that was just on the sheer basis that I was making, in the sense of like having multiple income streams rather than just writing for newspapers. I think it would be very privileged to say that you can just make a living just by writing for papers, just on a freelance basis, unless you are of a particular generation. And just in terms of like the statistics speaking, if you are white, male, university educated, your parents were, you know, journalists themselves, and usually they're over the age of about 50 when they're freelance and writing just for newspapers. I know several people like that, but they aren't my age. It would be privileged to say that you can just do that, as well as with the fact of other barriers. Just to pick up on a few points that have been said by Lucy and Rachel, because I've been taking notes while this has happened. In terms of I just want to like draw this out in terms of the like the response to the pandemic. I find it really fascinating, the fact that in the wake of such as what happened to George Floyd, for example, there was a sudden emphasis in newsrooms where they were going, oh my God, we've got to get Black writers in to write about these issues and we've got to pay them for it. Well, that's very well and good in practice, but the thing about it was the execution a lot of the time was really lazy, in the sense that they were doing like, you know, come and write about your traumas for us. But in the sense of the way that the two things overlap, why is it the fact that disabled individuals are not being afforded that? In the sense of that, of being paid to write about their community, their conditions and all that sort of thing. That is a problem within newsrooms. I don't know why that is. Frankly, there are a few editors I've worked with who have just sort of used it in the sense of being very entitled about it. That's just to draw a comparison. When it came to the kind of like, if I say kind of like the emotional impact of the pandemic, the thing about this was, so I kind of have a privilege in the sense that, so I'm autistic, but I'm very aware in the sense that other autistic individuals were part of the whole DNR controversy in quite large numbers. Right. But the thing about it is, like it was in the sense of people were coming to me and saying, you know, my GP has just rung me up and said, are you willing to die for this kind of thing? I cannot describe the feeling of that, the hearing that people who are effectively like you are coming to you and saying that they are being, you know, essentially forced into this. I could have told you 9 months prior to it becoming a story that this was happening on a national basis. And the fact that there aren't enough disabled reporters in newsrooms was really something, simply because it was just like the whole every single newspaper just sort of went, oh my God, this is outrageous. But it had been happening for months. I could have told you that like 9 months ago, just from having just purely observed. And yet that's a representation problem. It just, it defies belief.
I just said, because I'm still angry about it, I'm trying to get the BBC to cover the DL crisis, and they tell me it wasn't true. The BBC health team at the time, I haven't got over it, guys.
I pitched it to more than one publication, and I was told it was speculative. I pitched it in April 2020, and I was told it was speculative.
Me too, anecdotal.
Yeah, I was told. Yeah, anecdotal and speculative. That's what I was told. Yeah, that's what I was told. I was told it was too speculative and anecdotal for a news story.
You know, when it was in the mail the other day, I sent it to my old boss.
Yeah, I pitched it. I'm gonna name them. I pitched it to Metro, and I pitched it to the Independent, and I was told it was too speculative and too anecdotal at the time.
Yeah, thank you for.
I'm gonna get
Again, it should be talked about more, definitely, and it's just blatantly obvious. And but anyway, Jamie, do you have anything else to add about COVID's impact?
I think here it sounds like another place where the screenwriting world was very different from the mainstream media world. I mean, when it came to the DNR crisis, I was kind of relatedly explicitly told that I would not be prioritized for intensive care treatment were I to contract COVID, on the understanding that when it was a very limited resource, it needed to be saved for those people who were most likely to survive it. And as a disabled person, of course, and as the person who that was about, I was terrified and furious. But as somebody who also works in health and social care policy, obviously any kind of blanket imposition of DNRs is completely inappropriate, and this doesn't touch on that. But I understood my doctor's point that if they have one intensive care bed and 2 critically ill patients, and they have to decide which patient to give it to, they've got to make a decision somehow. And being in that position and kind of having to interface with that issue, both as part of my academic work, where I was involved in some lower level policy discussions around this, and my own life, I had to kind of exist at that point of conflict between my own fear and my experience, and my desire, of course, to be given access to absolutely all treatment I might need, and my recognition that if you're choosing between 2 people, you've got to choose somehow. And the fact that at points the medical profession in the UK thought it would come to that, and in other parts of Europe it came to those decisions explicitly, such as in Italy, whereas in the UK they did it by the, I think, far worse backdoor route of imposition of DNRs and then not offering people treatment, rather than making the decision at bedside at individual patient level, which was what's happening elsewhere. And I think for me that really, I was really like, why is this not being talked about? Why is nobody sharing these experiences? And so, as well as becoming the kind of core of my poetry pamphlet, it was also at the heart of the screenplay that I wrote, which kind of kicked off my writing career. And it was interesting because it felt like the kind of fictional media was far more interested in hearing these stories than the factual media was. If you look at the sort of, the more recent show Help, which explored the kind of COVID crisis in care homes, I think that was commissioned in a far more kind of honest and brutal way than a lot of the kind of media discussions that were happening in this factual basis. And so I found that actually the pandemic has really sped up the fictional media's interest in disability issues and in disabled people. Jack Thorne's McTaggart lecture focused on the experiences of deaf and disabled people in the media, and I know from my experience led to a huge amount of interest quite suddenly from commissioners and projects being set up to take work by deaf and disabled people. And we'll see whether they actually end up commissioning or making any of it, because it's one thing talking about it and it's another thing doing it. But it certainly seemed like there has been an increasing spotlight on the experiences of disabled people in the kind of that part of the media world. And I think now it's almost, the momentum is there, and it's about kind of continuing and expanding that momentum Whereas I feel like a lot of the kind of journalistic media just never picked up an interest in these stories to start with, which really kind of frustrated me. And I think if it had, I might not have moved so much into screenwriting, but I felt like that was the only place I was going to be able to tell the kinds of stories I wanted to and needed to. And the only way I had of making sure people like me were going to be reflected in any form of media, when it felt like the journalistic profession just wasn't willing to listen and wasn't willing to hold the government to account, or when it was the kind of requirements that neutral, sort of supposedly neutral media often has about, if you want us to report on this conversation with your doctor, we have to give your doctor the right of reply, even if you want to speak anonymously rather than in an attributed fashion, because of the kind of pretense of neutrality and fact checking, which then I think meant that, from my experience trying to source people to speak on the record about conversations with their doctors about access to ICU treatment, the kind of right of reply meant a lot of people were very unwilling to, because they didn't want to risk that relationship with their doctors. Whereas once I took it into fictional media, I could write the truth in a way that wasn't safe to report within kind of journalism.
And thank you. It's actually aligns with the next question about representation and the stories that should be told and that are not currently told, and who should tell them and how they should be told, and more importantly, like why it matters, because obviously it does. So maybe Jamie, you could elaborate on what you've been saying in terms of that the question, the stories that should be told, right, urgently.
So I think for me, I mean, the stories that I want to be, I'm writing the stories that I want to see told, and some of those stories aren't even particularly about disability, and disabled characters are part of the narrative because we're part of the world, and that's really important to me. And one of them is a rom-com featuring two people with significant physical impairments. One of them is a fictionalization of my own experience of writing and performing my show, not dying at the Barbican, while also sort of critically ill in hospital and negotiating permission to leave the ward with all of my meds and IVs and a staff member attached to me so that I could put it on. And then one of them explores, what if disability kind of wasn't a tragedy, and explores kind of progressive genetic conditions through a lens of kind of joyfulness and family and community, which I'm really passionate about and I think is really important. But I think one of my big concerns about the people who are telling stories, the stories that should be told, the stories we're hearing, is also a kind of a real lack of sort of intersectional experience, a lack of, apart from kind of, I know Matilda Amini has done some incredible work for television, but the number of Black disabled writers kind of who have access to opportunities in the screenwriting world is so minimal. I think, again, in journalism, most of the disabled journalists that I can think of, though not all, are white disabled journalists. And I'm kind of conscious on a panel talking about what stories should be told, about the kind of diversity of the panel and what that says about the diversity of disabled people in the media world more broadly, and about who gets access to the very few opportunities there are, or gets access to the connections and abilities to kind of create those opportunities. And I think certainly the screenwriting world does seem to be waking up to disabled narratives, but I think it's not enough to be kind of looking at these things in isolation. When you look at the deaths of disabled people during COVID, and then you look at how many of them were also people of color, and you look at how social class and financial status interacts with that, And I think it's very easy to kind of see these issues through a kind of single lens of one experience or of another. A lot of the Black people who are murdered by police are Black disabled people, and I want to see, you know, more commissioning of Black disabled writers to write about that. And I want to make sure that as we talk about the stories that we want to tell, the stories we want to watch, the stories we want to see told, that we don't end up replicating the same kind of dynamics of sort of white privilege and racism that run through the disabled community in the work that we're creating, in the stories that we're telling, in the people that we're talking to, and that we reach out beyond that. Otherwise, ultimately, I think for me, it will fail, because there is no real interaction with topics of disability without considering all of the issues of medical racism, of classism, of the impact of poverty, of sort of living in polluted areas, and the impact of that, both on sort of things that appear more quickly like asthma, but also the lifetime Alzheimer's risk if you live in a more heavily polluted area. And I think we really need to be kind of considering that at the heart of when we think about what stories should be told and who should be telling them.
Thank you. You're absolutely right. And in terms of intersectionality, Lucy, I know you also work on the intersection of disability and feminism, even in your own memoir about the disabled womanhood. That maybe you'd like to talk about that.
Okay, but I would try not to. Yeah, I did work on that intersection recently. I did a piece about sexual harassment of disabled women, but I think we need so much more of that. Totally echo what Jamie said about race, and different sorts of disabilities. So I think, like I said earlier, the stereotypical media disabled person is a manual wheelchair. And like, if you are not a manual wheelchair, do you even see yourself in the media? Probably not. I had a piece out today where they done an illustration of me in a manual wheelchair, and I wrote back and said, "Are you a power chair?" And they changed it, and it's great because you never see that. So definitely different disabilities, a hidden disability, chronic disability, all of it. I also could not answer questions without banging on a little bit about young people who need social care. Every time we see social care on the news of people to care, and it drives me up the wall. You know, care should be about living, not about dying. I don't know how many times I can say that until it becomes true, but I will. We need to be talking about how, as Jamie said earlier, you need the right care to allow you to work. You need the right care to allow you to socialize and have relationships, help kids and all the rest of it. But we see care in the media and something that only happens when you're old. So you've already had a job, and I had kids, and I had girlfriends, and now you can just be stuck at home. And drive me absolutely potty. So that's my thing. Social care for young people, please, someone before I truly do.
Thank you. And in terms of what both of you have been saying, Rachel, with your magazine on The Unwritten, I know you've been trying to unpick all kinds of stories. And I know even in your bio, you mentioned that you want to sort of break that standard of telling stories that are just, inspirational or traumatic. So would you maybe like to talk more about that?
Absolutely, yeah. So that's what we want to tell. That's what I want to tell more than anything, because I think this mainly comes from me being Northern, to be honest with you. I just love hearing about people's lives. I can listen to people tell me their life story all day, and I want to hear about the tiny mundane things about people's lives. And whenever it still happens whenever you see people on, more often than not, whenever you see disabled people on the TV, it'll be, oh, look at this little disabled kid, he's ran a marathon, or, well, not a marathon, but he's done like a walk for charity or something. Or this poor disabled person is living in a house without electricity. But there's no nuance, there's no in the middle, and we want the in the middle stories. We want, at the end of the day, it's like what Lucy and like what Jamie have already been saying. We're just people too, and we just want to live our lives, and we just want to tell our stories the same as everybody else, and we just want to have our views told the same as everybody else. And that was a big part of me setting up The Unwritten, because there are so many things that people think don't apply to disability. Like, a big part of it when we started getting pictures for The Unwritten was how many pictures we got about sex and sexuality and relationships, because there was just no platform really for disabled people to talk about just regular things that happen in their relationships and discovering sexuality and stuff. And this was things that wasn't like, how do I have sex, or how do I tell somebody that I'm disabled? Because those are articles that have been done to death. This was things like funny stories I've had when I've dated, or this is the bullshit that I've had when I've dated, or like but it was everything. And it was things like coming to terms with my body and how that helped my partner and things like that. And it was all of the little nuances together. And those are the things that people actually want to read, not the things that are how-to guides for how to do sex, because we like, not everybody has sex obviously, but we all at the end of the day just want to live our lives and talk about our lives, because at the end of the day we're all social creatures, and we all just want to talk. I think a big part of why people love telling their stories to journalists is because people love telling their stories. And that's honestly, like, it's often not hard to find sources, because people just love telling you their stuff. And when you say, yeah, I'll give you some money if you want to tell us your life story, you get a lot of pictures, and it's great. So, but no, that was silly. But no, it's genuinely just letting people tell their own stories in their own words. And those are the things that, and not having it retold from the lens of not from a non-disabled lens. That was the big part of setting up The Unwritten, not having it told through a non-disabled lens, because so often you can tell when a story is being written by someone who's non-disabled, and it hurts to read it. Like, when you see things, it's the tiny little nuances, like things like wheelchair bound and stuff like that, and it's like, oh, you were doing so well until you said wheelchair bound.
Can I very quickly, the thing that I find with non-disabled people writing this stuff is the obsession with the medical diagnosis. As if it matters. Why? But who cares? That really hurt me, because the story normally is social.
No, it's like That's one thing I always say to my writers. You don't have to include a person's medical diagnosis, even if it's relevant to the story, unless they freely give you their medical diagnosis. Like, that's none of your business. Why is that relevant?
And a number of times I file something without it in for an interview. I get a question from an editor. What do they have? I'm not going to tell you.
What
Right.
is their diagnosis? And I'm like, I don't know. Didn't ask them. didn't ask them.
Yeah, thank you for sharing and thank you for starting the unwritten also. We definitely need more.
Man, honestly, you'll make us cry. Don't so well so far.
So in terms of also telling more nuanced stories, Lydia, well, maybe in terms of autism, I know representation is still very, well, I don't know. Yeah, maybe, just tell us about what you think, because
Okay, in terms of this panel, I've got kind of a confession to make. I kind of feel a bit like an imposter. I never wanted to write about disability issues. I was kind of just pigeonholed into doing that. Then the pandemic came and basically I needed to make enough to cover my rent, and that was all that I was going to be commissioned for in terms of writing disability related stuff. Just because on the sheer basis, here is disabled person, they must write about disabled stuff. Like, it's just sort of that it still messes with my brain, to be honest, because in that sense I actually wanted to be an investigative reporter from a very young age, and it still, frankly, it still is a bit, to be honest, I still find it a bit painful in the sense that that's probably never going to happen. So in the sense of, just to pick up on what Jamie was saying in terms of like recognizing particular factors, I think it's really important in the sense that there needs to be a recognition of what is a token ally versus an actual ally. And I say that because there are, in the sense of such as with Black Lives Matter, which I gave earlier, it was so utterly tokenistic for editors to just go, oh, we must commission a black writer all of a sudden, just to write about, just on the pure basis that there was a black person who had died in a really horrible way. It also has the issue of trauma and the kind of like the inspiration thing there. In my view, you should have been already commissioning black writers and not just about the one particular subject. That is performative and that is tokenism, versus people who actually go, okay, come and write about this thing that you're good at, regardless of whether or not it's a disabled issue or not. So when Rachel mentioned, for example, about particular stories, for example, in the way that we tell them, the thing like, regardless or not of whether you liked Captain Tom and what he stood for in terms of values and all that sort of thing, it's really quite something to have. I think it was a 9-year-old child who had a diagnosis of terminal cancer or something like that. I can't quite remember what, this was too long ago. But they were doing basically what Captain Tom did, and suddenly, oh, that's so inspirational. There's this 9-year-old girl who is doing this. Does anyone not see how wrong that is, that a 9-year-old who has cancer is going around her frigging garden just to do something in regards to the pandemic? That's not inspirational. That's horrible. So, but I may have interpreted the question slightly literally, because I still think that journalists always have stories that they want to tell that they cannot necessarily tell, in the sense of having something specific in mind. So while I was listening to everyone else, I actually have a list, very small list. So sexual harassment within the media itself, I know of names, I know of places, and it's a story I still want to tell. But because journalists have this thing where, quote, dog doesn't eat dog, so that hasn't really been picked up. Bit too controversial to tell the truth about ourselves, apparently. I know of a particular foundation where allegations of corruption were made to me, that a foundation that deals with disabled individuals. Again, that wasn't picked up, and that was purely on the basis that like there was so speaking to editors about this, they would always go, that's not a story because disabled people are already supported in the UK by the benefit system. There's enough for them within the benefit system, when we know statistically there isn't. Like it just the fact that this person clearly hadn't met, like, I sort of want to ask journalists, have you ever met a disabled person sometimes, just so that you actually have the knowledge about us rather than having your own weird presumptions. There's also food poverty, and how if you're more disabled, you are more likely to experience food poverty. That's always just reduced to like one line. You see it in The Guardian where it goes, food poverty is more experienced by disabled people by this shocking statistic. There's never any like deep dive into why that is, or to look at the other factors in why that is. I can't remember who mentioned it in terms of policing and disabled individuals being hurt by police. That's something I would like to look in as well, because in the sense of police corruption, that is something that I hold very dear to me. And in the sense of allyship, the thing is, we need to be having a conversation in the sense of taking up the space, but giving space away to other people. So it's all very well to say we belong in such a space because we're disabled, we want to be here, we want to be represented. But I think on the sheer grounds of not progressing in terms of representation and telling the stories we want to, we need to be thinking about how we make space for other people. I had this weird experience recently where I got a commission and it came through where someone had sent it to me. They go, can you write about being autistic and being gay? First of all, I'm straight, so not really, just on the sheer grounds that I have no experience of being gay. Like it was ridiculous. So I said to them, can't you like actually find a gay autistic writer to write this for you? Just because I can't do this and it's really inappropriate. And also, I don't know whether you thought like I'm gay or something, like just on the sheer grounds of just you're really quite being offensive about this. So I sent her the details of an autistic gay writer that I know who got the commission. He wrote it and was paid for it, and he actually emailed me to say thank you for doing that, nobody else like has ever done that. And I found that really shocking, because surely just on the basis that you shouldn't be taking up where it's not for you to be there in terms of the space, you shouldn't be telling the story that you're not a part of, in a way.
Jamie, you have your hand raised, right? Would you like to?
Yeah. I wanted to kind of come in on something around sort of tokenism and the experiences of being a token. And I like it is so important that newsrooms should already have been commissioning disabled writers long before the pandemic, and Black writers long before the murder of George Floyd and the kind of increased visibility of Black Lives Matter. But I also think that sometimes tokenism is better than nothing, and that it is sort of that it's far better that they were commissioning Black writers and paying Black writers to write those pieces responding to it than not. And that a lot of the work I get, I do think probably comes partially from a tokenistic basis. They want a disabled person to write about disability, and they probably wouldn't commission me on something else. But it's still, I'd rather they commissioned me than that they commissioned someone who wasn't disabled. I'd rather that they paid me than that they paid someone who wasn't disabled. And that I'd rather that I got the credit than that someone who wasn't disabled got it. And I think that often tokenistic opportunities are the only ones that we get, but that they're sometimes a starting point, that once we've had once I've had the tokenistic commission, maybe the next one I get can be kind of on the strength of the previous one, and I can move away from that. And it seems really important to me that we really emphasize how much it is crucial that people from communities are the ones that are invited to respond to those, even when that is in a tokenistic fashion.
Of course. The thing about that is, though, I completely agree with what you're saying, but I think we're in 2022. We need to be thinking in the sense of progressing further in a way. So I completely understand and I completely agree with what you're saying, but I think that it needs to be in the sense that if a newspaper, for example, says we want media diversity, then they need to start being a bit more radical about it and actually doing it in more than just a half-hearted manner, to be honest.
Yeah,
I agree, but sorry, Jim.
No, you go for it. I've already spoken recently.
Hey, I was covering Westminster. I thought that was what I wanted to do. Right. If you said to 17-year-olds, what do you want to do? I would tell them I want to be a political reporter. But like, Westminster, very not accessible, by the way. But also it wasn't what was making me get up in the morning. What was making me get up in the morning was telling real people's stories and disabled people's stories. So I kind of told myself I don't want to be pigeonholed. And then ignore the fact that actually that was what I wanted to do. It took me years to work out actually it was much better at that. And it was much more, it feels much more worthwhile than covering crap that Boris said for a full time. I think sometimes we're so desperate not to be pigeonholed that we forget that we're really good at telling these stories.
Yeah, it's so rare now that I don't write about disability, that when I write about things that aren't disability, people will go to me, oh, I didn't know you wrote about this. So I was doing an interview last week, and actually the person I was interviewing went, I'm not being funny, but I thought you only wrote about disability. And I was like, I write about other things as well.
My Channel 4 series, my first one isn't particularly about disability, and disabled characters are quite minor, and it's not a major part of the plot line, because my other 3 projects are all exactly about disability. But I knew that if my first series was the disability series, I would always be pegged as the disabled writer. So instead I decided to make it about trans stuff and get pegged as the trans writer instead, which like makes a change anyway. People see that one slightly less quickly than they see the impairment, so might as well foreground that, because I'll get plenty of disability commissions anyway eventually, hopefully.
Well, now you've got 2 pigeonholes. It's great.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing your stories. We're actually running out of time, and I don't think I can take over the kitchen forever. So I think we have to end here. But it was genuinely amazing to hear from all of you. Thank you so much for being so open and honest about your experiences. And yeah, I'm sure many students will find this panel very helpful and eye-opening, and just thank you. And thank you to Chloe and Gurmail for interpreting. Yeah, very, very grateful for coming here tonight. And does anyone else have anything else to say? Just you.
No, that's enough for me.
On that note,
It's always great to be in a virtual room of so much disabled, and I look forward to watching you all take over the world.
Oh, you! How dare you!
I guess I can stop recording now. And yeah, thank you again.
Oh, thank you all so much.